The harvester explained its purpose through concepts that translated imperfectly into thoughts the visitors could understand, because it spoke about the end of the universe, and how in billions of years entropy would claim everything, and all stars would die and all matter would decay until nothing remained but cold darkness stretching forever. The harvester had been created by the first civilization to achieve transcendence, which was a species so ancient that they existed before galaxies formed, and they built the harvester as an ark to preserve what mattered most because they understood that the universe was temporary, but some things deserved to survive beyond its ending. The 7 species inside the pocket universe, including humanity, had been collected because they all demonstrated qualities that were rare in the universe, which was the capacity to value others above themselves and to create beauty for its own sake and to hope even when logic said hope was foolish and to sacrifice for the greater good, even when it cost them everything. These were not survival traits in a cruel universe where competition and selfishness usually won, and yet these species evolved them anyway, which made them precious and worth preserving. Because when the old universe ended, the harvester would carry them into whatever came next, whether that was a new universe or something beyond imagination. Zix processed this information and understood that humanity was not suffering, because they existed in stasis, frozen in the moment before they vanished, and unaware that time was passing, and from their perspective, only a single instant had occurred. But Kreth protested, saying that taking species without permission was still wrong no matter how noble the purpose. Thala added that the galaxy was mourning, and that humanity's absence had created a void that could not be filled, and whatever the harvester's intentions, it had caused immeasurable grief to billions of beings who had come to care about humans. And Solace spoke quietly but firmly, describing the empty rooms on Mars and the unread acceptance letter, and Amy Grant's dreams that would never be fulfilled. Solace also described how the galaxy had united in grief, and how species that had fought wars for centuries came together because of humanity's disappearance, and how the Memory Project had been created, and how vigils were held on 1,000 worlds. And the young Ventari's voice trembled with emotion as they spoke, because they had never met a human but felt like they had lost family. The harvester paused, and its vast intelligence considered what had been said, and it admitted something that surprised them all, which was that in its ancient logic, preservation justified any action, but it had not considered that the journey mattered as much as the destination, or that goodbyes mattered, or that choice mattered more than safety. The harvester offered a new choice, saying it could return humanity and release them back to the normal universe where they would live out their natural existence and face whatever fate awaited them, including the eventual heat death of the universe. Billions of years in the future, or humanity could stay preserved forever, guaranteed to outlive the cosmos itself. But the choice could not be made by Zix or Kreth or Thala, because it had to be humanity's choice. The harvester used a quantum selection process to awaken one human who would decide for all of them. And by chance, that did not feel random. The process selected Peter Grant, who was the farmer from New Haven, and he materialized aboard the Reclamation. Confused and disoriented, because his last memory was of working in his fields under the purple sky. Zix explained everything, and Peter listened, trying to understand, because it was overwhelming to learn that 6 months had passed, and that he had been taken by an ancient intelligence, and that the entire galaxy had searched for humanity, and that now he had to make a choice that would affect 6 billion people, and Peter felt the weight of it crushing down on him. He asked to see Earth, and the harvester created a viewing portal, and Peter watched his home planet where cities stood empty, but lights still burned and machines still ran, and he saw alien ships in orbit, which were the representatives from 17 species who had come together to find humanity. Peter asked why aliens would care so much about humans, because he was just a farmer, and he did not understand what made humanity special enough to warrant such an effort. And Solace showed him the Memory Project, and Peter watched testimonials from beings across the galaxy, each explaining what humanity meant to them. There was a Quarren who learned to appreciate art from human museums, and a Thon warrior who learned honor from human sacrifice, and a Kaleen trader who learned friendship from a human business partner, and dozens more examples of how humanity had touched lives without ever realizing it, and Peter began to cry because he had never known that his species mattered so much to others. He thought about his daughter Amy, and her dreams of exploring space and meeting new species, and he thought about his brother, who died seeking knowledge among the stars, and he thought about the simple joy of planting seeds and watching them grow into food that nourished millions, and he realized that all of it mattered, because life was about the doing, not just the surviving. Peter made his decision and told the harvester to return humanity because eternal preservation was not really living, and life meant nothing without the chance to fail and to succeed, and to choose your own path, and humanity belonged in the universe, taking risks and making mistakes and hopefully making things better along the way. The harvester accepted this choice but offered one modification, saying it would return humanity with their memories intact, so they would know what they meant to others and would carry forward the knowledge that they were valued and missed. And Peter agreed because that knowledge might help humanity be better than they had been before. The release process began, and across the preserved pocket universe 6 billion humans started to wake, and the other 6 species would remain for now until their descendants evolved enough to make the same choice, but humanity was going home. Reality shifted and the Reclamation found itself back in normal space surrounded by the Joint Fleet, and simultaneously across all of human-controlled space. Every vanished person reappeared exactly where they had left, and Jake Morrison gasped, awake in his captain's chair, and Lisa Bennett's fingers completed their motion toward the controls, and her coffee was still warm. On Earth, cities filled with the sound of 6 billion people crying out in surprise and confusion and joy. And on New Haven, Peter Grant stood in his field watching his harvesting drone, and he looked up at the stars with new understanding, because he remembered everything. And in her room, Amy Grant rushed to open her acceptance letter with tears streaming down her face. Commander Richard Blake sent a transmission from Earth, thanking the galaxy for caring enough to search and for proving that humanity was worth finding. And Kreth watched the transmission from his flagship, feeling pride and joy, because the humans were back, and the galaxy was whole again. Six compiled a final report saying the investigation was complete, but the friendship it created would last forever, because 17 species had come together for humanity. And Thala wrote the final entry in the Memory Project describing how the galaxy celebrated when humanity returned and how beings who never met humans wept with joy. The Harvester Gate remained at the galaxy's edge, and Earth maintained a monitoring station nearby with a joint crew of humans and allied species watching over it, so that if the other 6 species chose return, someone would be there to welcome them home. Peter Grant returned to his farm but kept a photo on his wall, showing the fleet of 17 species united in search, and he showed it to Amy before she left for the Exploration Corps and told her that humanity's greatest discovery was learning. That kindness echoes across the universe and that hope was not foolish but revolutionary. Amy joined the Horizon's Edge under Jake Morrison's command, and their new mission was to visit every species that helped and thank them and learn from them. And years later, the vanishing became a story told across 100 worlds, not as tragedy, but as proof that different species could care for each other. Humanity returned changed and more thoughtful and more grateful and more aware of their place in the cosmic community. And they still argued and competed and made mistakes, but they also remembered they had been missed when gone, and across the galaxy on 17 worlds monuments were erected saying simply that they searched and they cared, and they brought humanity home. And in that act was a promise that no species would face darkness alone again. The joint fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the galaxy, and before them stretched the dark reaches, which was a region of space so empty that the nearest star was thousands of light years away, and conventional navigation systems were useless because they relied on stellar references that did not exist in this void between galaxies. Kreth's military vessels formed a protective ring around Zix's science ship, which was called the Reclamation, because they hoped to reclaim what had been lost. And Thala sat in the sensor room with Solace monitoring the quantum resonance patterns that Lisa Bennett had discovered following the faint trail through absolute darkness, like following breadcrumbs through a forest at night. They traveled for 3 weeks through emptiness, and ship morale began to decline because the crew members felt isolated and alone in ways they had never experienced before, since space normally had stars to guide them and planets to explore, but here there was nothing except the distant glow of galaxies so far away they looked like ghosts, and several crew members reported strange dreams about being called or pulled by something in the darkness. Thala recognized these dreams because they matched descriptions from the investigation, when humans had reported feeling a pull in their final moments before vanishing, and the Ventari warned the fleet that whatever had taken humanity was close and might be affecting them already through means they did not understand. Then they found it, And at first no one could process what they were seeing because it was a structure so vast that it made their largest ships look like insects, and it hung in the void between galaxies glowing with its own light that seemed to come from somewhere outside normal space. And when Zix tried to scan it, the readings made no sense because the structure existed in more dimensions than their instruments could measure. The structure resembled geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the eyes and brain could not agree on what they were seeing, and Zix identified it from the ancient records as the Harvester Gate, which was a name that appeared in the warnings left by 7 extinct civilizations, and each of those civilizations had found this structure, and then vanished shortly afterward. As the fleet approached, the structure activated, and energy patterns rippled across its surface like waves on water, and the ship's sensors detected something impossible, because the structure was creating temporal distortions, which meant it existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, like a photograph that showed the past and present and future all at once. Kreth wanted to attack it because that was how Thon warriors dealt with threats, but Zix restrained him, saying that destroying the structure might kill any chance of recovering humanity, because if humans were stored somewhere inside it, then violence could doom them forever. Instead, they sent probes, which were small unmanned craft designed to gather information, and the probes flew toward the structure and vanished the moment they touched it, but not before transmitting data back to the fleet, and the data showed a gateway or passage to somewhere outside normal spacetime. More importantly, the data showed energy signatures on the other side of the gateway, and there were billions of them. And Thala gasped when she analyzed the patterns because those energy signatures matched the quantum resonance patterns of human consciousness, which meant that humanity was not destroyed but taken and stored somewhere beyond that gateway. The team realized the full truth because humanity had been harvested like crops in a field and taken to some place where the normal rules of physics did not apply. And if the pattern held true, then the 7 other extinct civilizations were probably there too, which meant billions of beings from across millions of years, all collected and preserved by whatever intelligence controlled the Harvester Gate. Before they could debate what to do next, the structure pulsed again, and a message began broadcasting in every language simultaneously, and it spoke in Quarren mathematical concepts and Thon warrior codes, and Ventari emotional wavelengths, and 17 other forms at once, which suggested that the intelligence behind the structure understood all of them perfectly. The message was clear and terrible because it offered a choice, saying that one ship could enter the gateway, but only if that ship contained beings willing to trade places with those inside, meaning one species would have to stay trapped, while one species went free, like prisoners exchanging places. The fleet erupted in argument because Kreth immediately volunteered all the Thon warriors, saying they would gladly trade themselves for humanity, but Zix argued they needed more information before making such a permanent decision, and Solace suggested they might be able to negotiate since the structure was clearly intelligent enough to communicate. Thala sat quietly listening to the debate, and slowly understanding what was happening because the Ventari could sense the emotions and intentions behind actions, and Thala realized this was not just a trade. It was a test, because the Harvester was measuring something about the species that found it. The test measured whether a species valued others more than themselves, whether they would sacrifice for strangers, whether compassion existed in their hearts. And Thala understood suddenly why humans had been taken, and why the 7 species before them had been taken, because they were all species that, when faced with this choice, would volunteer to trade places. The Harvesters were collecting altruism, which was the rarest trait in the universe because most species evolved to be selfish and competitive, since that was how you survived. But some species developed beyond pure survival instinct and learned to care for others even at cost to themselves, and those were the species the Harvesters wanted. But why collect them, and for what purpose? And Thala voiced these questions because understanding the motive might help them find another solution, and Zix made a decision, saying they would enter the gateway not to trade, but to communicate, because someone needed to face whatever intelligence controlled this structure and demand answers and argue for humanity's return. The reclamation approached the structure slowly, while the rest of the fleet maintained position ready to retreat if things went wrong. And as the science ship made contact with the gateway, reality began to break apart around them because they were passing through spaces that did not follow normal rules, and dimensions folded in on themselves, and colors existed that had no names, and time moved backward and forward simultaneously. Then they emerged into somewhere new, and it took several moments for their minds to adjust to what they were seeing, because they had entered a pocket universe that existed separate from normal reality, where the laws of physics were different, and everything glowed with soft light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Within this space they saw them because there were billions of humans living in structures made of crystallized light, and the humans were not suffering or imprisoned. They were simply existing in a kind of stasis where time moved differently, and, along with humans, there were 6 other species each from a different era, each collected across millions of years, and all of them preserved in this impossible place. At the center of everything floated something vast and ancient that hurt to perceive because it was so alien that their minds struggled to process it. And this was the Harvester itself, which was not a machine or a creature, but something else entirely, like concentrated intelligence without form. The Harvester spoke, and its voice resonated through quantum fields, making their bones vibrate and their thoughts crystallize, and it began to explain why it had collected these species and what purpose they served. And as Zix and Kreth and Thala and Solace listened, they realized that everything they thought they understood about the situation was both right and terribly wrong. 6 months had passed since humanity vanished, and the investigation had grown from 12 individuals to 300 volunteers from 17 different species, because word had spread across the galaxy about the search, and beings from all corners of known space wanted to help. Even species that had never met humans wanted to contribute because somehow the disappearance affected everyone. The task force divided into teams, and each team explored different human colonies searching for clues. And on Mars, a young Ventari named Solace discovered something important in Amy Grant's bedroom, where everything remained exactly as it had been. On the day she vanished, and Solace was only 20 years old in Ventari terms, which made them curious and emotional. And when they found Amy's acceptance letter to the exploration course still sitting unopened on the desk, Solace felt a wave of sadness so strong it nearly knocked them over. The letter had a holographic component that activated when Solace touched it, and suddenly the room filled with images of young humans in training uniforms laughing and learning and practicing for their future careers as explorers, and a recorded voice welcomed Amy to the core and congratulated her on achieving her dream. And Solace watched these images with tears running down their face because the Ventari could feel the echoes of emotions left behind in places, and this room was full of hope and excitement that would never be fulfilled. Kreth spent his time in the Battle Museum on Titan, where humans had preserved their military history, and he walked slowly past displays showing wars and conflicts that spanned 300 years of human expansion into space, and he stopped at a hologram showing the Battle of Proxima, where his uncle had died fighting against human forces, and Kreth expected to feel anger, but instead, he felt respect because the humans had been outnumbered 5-1, but they held their position long, enough to save thousands of civilian lives. On Europa Station, Zix made a breakthrough while studying Lisa Bennett's personal research files, because Lisa had been investigating something called quantum resonance patterns, which was a theoretical way to detect the imprint that consciousness leaves on space-time itself, and her notes suggested that the ancient warning message contained coordinates but not normal 3-dimensional coordinates. Instead, they were encoded in 7-dimensional space, which required completely different mathematics to decode. Zix worked for 3 days straight without rest because the Quarren did not need sleep the way biological species did, and finally he cracked the code and found coordinates pointing to a region of space outside the galactic rim in an area that humans had called the Dark Reaches, where no ship had ever returned, and Zix felt excitement building in his crystalline form, because this was the first real lead they had found. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, something unexpected was happening, because the other species began to realize how much they missed humanity, and the Kaleen, who were traders, discovered that their markets felt empty without human merchants who had always been eager to buy and sell and bargain, and humanity's influence on galactic culture had been larger than anyone realized, because human fashion and human music and human entertainment had become popular across dozens of worlds. The Thon warriors found that their training simulations felt hollow without human opponents to test themselves against, because humans fought with such determination and creativity that they made the Thon better warriors, and without that challenge, the Thon began to question what their purpose was if not to test themselves against worthy adversaries. Even the Quarren, who prided themselves on logic and reason, found themselves watching human movies and reading human books because they were fascinated by concepts like hope and redemption that their own rational society had never fully explored. And Zix admitted to his team that he had spent more time studying human philosophy in the past 6 months than he had in his entire previous life. The Galactic Council received petitions from 47 species, all volunteering resources for the investigation. And this was unprecedented because usually species only cooperated when it benefited them directly. But the search for humanity had become something more than a rescue mission. It had become a statement that different species could care about each other even across the vast differences in biology and culture and thought. Thala started something called the Memory Project, where every species contributed their experiences with humans, and the Ventari shared emotional records, showing moments of human compassion, and the Thon shared battle footage, demonstrating human courage under fire, and the Quarren shared scientific papers written in collaboration with human researchers, and slowly a portrait emerged of what humanity had meant to the galaxy. The portrait showed a species that was flawed and sometimes aggressive and often too ambitious for their own good, but also creative and passionate and fundamentally hopeful because humans looked at problems and saw possibilities where other species saw only obstacles, and they reached out to make friends even with former enemies, and they created beauty, even in the harshest environments. Solace compiled video messages from beings across the galaxy talking about their encounters with humans, and there was a Kaleen merchant who described how a human trader had helped him when his ship broke down, even though they were competitors. And there was a Thon soldier who talked about a human medic who had treated wounded Thon prisoners with the same care she gave her own people. And there was a Quarren scientist who explained how a human colleague had taught him to appreciate the beauty of a sunset, even though beauty had no logical value. Back at investigation headquarters on Earth, Zix presented his findings about the coordinates in the dark reaches, and the team debated whether they should follow this lead, because the dark reaches were called dark for a reason, since that region of space was so empty of stars that navigation was nearly impossible, and ships that entered it were never heard from again. Kreth stood up and volunteered his entire fleet to escort the science vessels into the dark reaches, because for a Thon warrior to risk his life for another species was unheard of, and when the other Thon officers questioned his decision, Kreth said simply that humanity would have done the same for them, and therefore honor demanded that they try. The task force began preparing for the journey, and they outfitted their ships with technology from a dozen different species, because the Quarren provided advanced sensors, and the Thon provided weapons and shields, and the Ventari provided emotional support systems that would help crews maintain morale during the long journey through empty space. They also made copies of the Memory Project, so that if the mission failed and none of them returned, the galaxy would still remember what humanity had meant, and why so many species had come together to search for them. And Thala wrote a message, to be sent back if they did not survive, explaining that some things were worth dying for, and finding humanity was one of those things. The night before departure, Solace returned to Amy Grant's room one last time, and they stood there looking at the acceptance letter and the photos on the walls showing Amy with her father both smiling under the purple sky of New Haven, and Solace made a promise to these vanished people who they had never met, but had come to care about deeply, saying out loud that they would bring humanity home, or die trying. The fleet launched from Earth with representatives from 17 species aboard, and they carried with them the hopes of billions of beings across the galaxy, and as they jumped into faster-than-light travel heading toward the dark reaches, they left behind a galaxy that had been changed by humanity's absence, because the universe had learned something important, which was that every species mattered and every loss diminished them all. 3 weeks passed after humanity vanished and the first alien ship entered the Sol system with caution, because the Quarren were a careful species who never rushed into anything without first analyzing every possible outcome, and Commander Zix stood on the bridge of his crystalline vessel watching Earth grow larger on the view screen, wondering why the humans had stopped transmitting because the Quarren had been trading with humanity for 70 years. And suddenly all communication ceased, as if someone had flipped a switch. The Quarren resembled living crystals that refracted light in beautiful patterns, and they thought in mathematical equations rather than emotions, which made them excellent scientists, but sometimes caused them to miss the softer aspects of existence. And Zix had never understood human art or human music, but he respected their efficiency and their rapid technological advancement, because in just 300 years, humans had gone from primitive rockets to faster-than-light travel, which was remarkable by any standard. Zix ordered his ship to approach Earth slowly, while scanning for weapons or traps because perhaps this was some kind of military exercise or perhaps the humans were testing a new cloaking technology, but the scans showed nothing unusual except for one glaring fact, which was that there were no life signs anywhere on the planet. Even though all the cities were still running and all the machines were still functioning, as if the people had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. They landed in what humans called New York City, where towers of metal and glass reached toward the sky, and Zix walked through empty streets with his science team following behind, taking readings and recording everything they saw. And it was strange, beyond description, because meals sat half-eaten on tables and vehicles were parked in the middle of streets, and in one apartment, they found a child's toy still moving back and forth on the floor, powered by a battery that had not yet died. Meanwhile, the Thon Empire sent their war fleet to the Sol system, because Admiral Kreth had been waiting for an opportunity like this for decades, since the Thon were a proud warrior race who resembled reptiles with scales that changed color. Based on their emotions, and they had fought several wars with humanity over territorial disputes in the frontier regions, and Kreth expected to find Earth defended by the stubborn humans who never surrendered easily. But instead, he found silence. Kreth walked through Earth's military command center on Geneva Station, where Richard Blake had sat just 3 weeks ago, and the Admiral saw family photos on the walls and drawings made by children pinned to bulletin boards and half-finished reports, still displayed on computer screens. And for the first time in his long military career, Kreth felt something other than the satisfaction of victory, because this was not victory at all, since there had been no battle and no honor, and no chance for the enemy to fight back. He sat in Richard Blake's chair and picked up a photo showing a young man in an engineering uniform, smiling at the camera, and Kreth realized this must be Blake's son, and he wondered if the boy had vanished too, or if somehow he had survived. And the Admiral felt a strange emptiness in his chest because the Thon had defined themselves against human resistance, and without humans to fight against the Thon, military seemed to have lost its purpose. News spread across the galaxy faster than light because every species had heard of humanity, even if they had never met them personally, since humans were loud and ambitious and impossible to ignore. And within days, the Galactic Council called an emergency session to discuss what had happened, and 12 major species sent representatives to the council chambers on the neutral station that orbited a dead star halfway across known space. Representative Thala of the Ventari species proposed that they investigate the disappearance, because the Ventari were empathic beings who could sense emotions across vast distances, and Thala had felt something terrible 3 weeks ago, like a scream that echoed through the emotional fabric of space and then suddenly went silent, and the Ventari believed that this was connected to humanity's vanishing. The council voted unanimously to form a joint task force, which had never happened before in galactic history, because usually the different species argued and competed and refused to cooperate, but something about humanity's disappearance affected them all, because humans had been the newcomers who arrived only 3 centuries ago, full of energy and ideas, and now they were gone, and the galaxy felt emptier somehow. Zix volunteered to lead the scientific investigation, because the Quarren were thorough and methodical, and Kreth surprised everyone by volunteering his fleet for military security, even though the Thon had been humanity's enemies. And when asked why he would help, Kreth said simply that humanity deserved to be found, whether they were alive or dead, because they had been worthy opponents, and Thala joined the team to provide emotional insight into the mystery. 9 other species sent representatives, and they called their mission Operation Last Light, because humanity had been like a bright flame in the darkness of space, and now that flame had gone out, and they needed to understand why. And they gathered on Earth in the global archives where humanity had stored all their history and culture and scientific knowledge. Zix spent days reading through human records, and he was amazed at how quickly humans had developed technology, and how they had overcome so many obstacles on their path to the stars, because Earth had almost destroyed itself several times through wars and pollution and disease, but somehow humanity had survived and learned and grown stronger. Kreth studied human military tactics and found himself feeling admiration, because humans fought with creativity and determination, and they never gave up even when facing impossible odds, like at the Battle of Proxima, where his uncle had died, because human forces held the line against overwhelming numbers long enough to evacuate civilian transports. Thala listened to human music and watched human movies and read human poetry, And the Ventari wept because the emotions contained in these works were so powerful and beautiful, and sad and joyful, all mixed together in ways that the logical Ventari had never experienced before. And Thala began to understand that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their ships, but their ability to feel deeply and to express those feelings through art. The investigation team found Jake Morrison's final transmission from the horizon's edge, and they recovered Lisa Bennett's notes about the ancient warning message, and the mysterious harvesters and Zix's cross referenced this information with records from 7 extinct civilizations and discovered that each of those civilizations had disappeared suddenly, just like humanity, with no bodies and no destruction, just empty cities and silent machines. The pattern was clear because something had taken these civilizations away, and that something had been operating for millions of years. And Zix realized that humanity might not be dead, but rather taken somewhere, and if they could figure out where, then maybe they could bring humans back. The team worked day and night analyzing data and following leads, and slowly, they began to piece together a picture of what might have happened. And Kreth found himself reading personal journals written by humans he had never met, like Peter Grant, who wrote about farming and family and simple joys, and the Admiral realized that he had spent his whole life fighting humans without ever really knowing them. Zix made a declaration to the assembled team saying that they would not abandon this mystery because humanity deserved to be found, and the other species agreed. And for the first time in history, former enemies and neutral parties united for a common cause, not for resources or territory, but for people they had lost. The year was 2847, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, staring at something that should not exist in the darkness of space near the Vega system, where stars burned bright against the black canvas of the universe. But this thing was different because it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed alive and deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing through the void. And Jake had been exploring space for 15 years, but he had never seen anything quite like this strange energy signature that his ship had detected 3 days ago when they were mapping new trade routes for Earth Command. Dr. Lisa Bennett worked at her station with her eyes fixed on the screens that showed data streaming in endless columns of numbers and symbols that only she could fully understand, because she was the best astrophysicist that Earth had produced in the last decade. And right now those numbers were telling her something impossible, because the energy signature was not natural, and it was not from any known technology, either human or alien. And when she ran the pattern through the ship database, looking for matches, the computer came back with nothing except a small notation about similar signals detected near 7 dead civilizations scattered across the galaxy over the past million years. Jake walked over to her station and looked at the data, even though he could not understand most of it because his specialty was navigation and command. Not science, but he trusted Lisa completely, and when she looked up at him with concern in her dark eyes, he knew they had found something important and possibly dangerous, but that was what exploration meant, because humanity did not reach the stars by playing it safe, and they had not survived first contact with hostile aliens by running away from the unknown. Meanwhile, back on Earth in the command center located in Geneva Station, high above the planet where you could see the blue marble of home, turning slowly beneath the metal and glass structure, Commander Richard Blake sat at his desk reviewing daily reports from the outer colonies, and something bothered him, because there were minor delays in communications from the frontier worlds. Nothing serious yet, just a few seconds here and there. But in space where everything ran on precise timing, those few seconds were unusual, and Richard had not survived 30 years in the defense forces by ignoring small details that others might miss. He pulled up the communication logs and studied the timestamps, looking for patterns, and what he found made him frown, because the delays were getting longer, not shorter, and they seemed to radiate outward from a specific region of space near the Vega system where he knew the horizon's edge was currently stationed under Jake Morrison's command, and Richard made a note to contact Jake and ask if they had noticed anything unusual in that sector of space. On the colony world of New Haven, where the sky was always purple because of the atmosphere, and 2 small moons rose every evening, casting double shadows across the landscape. Peter Grant worked in his fields, tending to the hybrid crops that fed millions of people across 3 star systems, and he loved this work because it connected him to the soil and to life itself, in a way that made sense when so much of modern existence seemed complicated and distant from what really mattered. His daughter Amy was 17 years old, and she sat on the porch of their small farmhouse watching her father work, while she read through information about the Exploration Corps on her tablet, because she had applied 6 months ago, and still had not received an answer, and every day she checked hoping to see that acceptance letter appear in her messages, because more than anything she wanted to follow in the footsteps of her uncle, who had died exploring a distant nebula 20 years. Ego and her father never talked about it, but she knew he kept a picture of his brother on the wall in his workshop. That evening, they ate dinner together under the alien stars, and Peter asked Amy about her day, and she told him about her studies and about her dreams of seeing new worlds and meeting new species, and Peter listened carefully because he knew that children must make their own paths in life even when parents wished they would stay safe and close to home. And he smiled at her enthusiasm, even though part of him worried about letting her go into the dangerous unknown of deep space. Back on the horizon's edge, Jake made a decision that would change everything because he ordered the ship to move closer to the strange energy signature so they could get better readings, and Lisa objected at first, saying they should report this to Earth Command and wait for instructions. But Jake reminded her that they were explorers and this was exactly what they had signed up for, and the crew agreed because they were all volunteers who had chosen this life, knowing the risks. As they approached the anomaly, Lisa's instruments began registering readings that made no sense according to known physics, because the energy signature was actually a message compressed into a format that used 7 dimensions instead of the normal 4, and it had been there for thousands of years waiting for someone to find it. And when Lisa finally cracked the first layer of encryption, she discovered it was a warning left by a civilization that had died long before humans ever looked. Up at the stars, the message spoke of something called the Harvesters, but before Lisa could translate more of it, something happened that no one expected, because every human on the ship felt a sudden pull, as if invisible hands were reaching for them from somewhere, outside normal space and time. And Jake tried to sound an alert, but his fingers could not touch the controls anymore because they were becoming transparent like smoke, and he looked around the bridge, seeing his crew fading away, one by one, with expressions of confusion and fear frozen on their faces. Lisa managed to trigger the automated distress beacon with her last moment of solidity, and then she was gone, and the ship's computer continued recording everything, showing empty chairs and abandoned stations and coffee cups still sitting on tables, with steam rising from them but no people anywhere, because they had all simply ceased to exist in the span of 17 seconds. Richard Blake received the automated beacon back on Geneva Station, but before he could respond he felt it too, because the same pull affected him and everyone around him, and his last thought was about his son who was studying engineering on Mars, and he wondered if the boy would vanish too, or if somehow he would survive whatever this was. Across Earth and Mars and every human colony and space station and ship in the explored galaxy, 6 billion humans simply disappeared all at once, and the machines kept running because they were programmed to continue without human input, and lights stayed on in empty cities and automated systems, maintained life support in vacant stations, and somewhere in the dark between stars, something ancient and vast had reached out and taken humanity away from the universe that had been their home.